Okay, hello everybody. Hopefully everyone can hear me. When the mouse starts moving around on the screen, you'll know if you can or you can't. So please let me know if you can't hear me or you can't see my screen. All right, brilliant. Hello. It is another sunny Tuesday. It's just gone 4 o'clock, so we're a couple of minutes late, but that's always good. Gives us lots of time to arrive and sit down and do all of those important things. So welcome again to another Claromentis online drop-in Q&A session. And as always, just going to run through the format a little bit. So over the course of the week or the time from which we advertise the drop-in, you guys send in your questions, and then today, me and you try and answer those questions, which is always very exciting. So today we have a few very, very good questions, which will hopefully help everybody. So we're going to go over those questions at the end of the session. If we kind of have a little bit more time, we're going to open up the floor to answer any other questions that you might have. But as always, please do remember that in the GoToMeeting area, there is a chat box. So you can type your questions in there or anything you would like to ask or any thoughts or feelings, and I'll be able to see them on a separate screen. So feel free to answer as we go, ask as we go rather, and I will answer as and when I can. Brilliant. All right, okay, so let's get started. So the first thing we are going to look at today is one of our applications, actually, and this is a question that's coming from Lois, and it's really about Policy Manager, so kind of basic configuration, how to set it up, and what to use it for. And Policy Manager is one of my favorite applications because it's actually very, very clever because it takes documents that you've uploaded to the system and it turns them into small policy objects that you can then distribute to lots of different people in the system and make sure everyone is agreeing to your policies, which is always a good thing. And it's also a very, very good tool if you do start to use the intranet as a sort of policy manager system. So as well as having things in the document management system called policy, it's also quite nice that you have an area that's dedicated to policies. So with that in mind, let's start having a look at Policy Manager itself. And now for the purposes of today, we're going to just have a quick look at the front end of Policy Manager, and then we're going to go straight into the admin panel and configure some bits and pieces. So into Policy Manager we go. So Policy Manager looks like this. On the left-hand side, we have lots of different categories, which can then have subcategories of policies underneath them. In the middle, we get icons of those categories. So that's simply a repeat of categories on the left in the middle here with our lovely little icons. You can see within policies, we have a dedicated search area. And now in the new 7.4 search at the top of the box here, you can include Policy Manager objects in that search. So as well as having this dedicated search area, people can also find policy objects up there as well. And then you've got a few more standard bits and pieces. So we've got our list view, which swaps to like this kind of list view. And we also have the icon view, which we were just on. Then within Policy Manager itself, you have this area, which is My Policies. You also have an A to Z of policies, and then the ability to add a policy if you can do that. Now from the front end, as always, everything looks very beautiful, very simple and very user-friendly. But there's a lot of setup for Policy Managers just to make sure that permissions are right, because permissions are a huge part of the way Policy Manager works. And also there are a few customization bits and pieces that you can play around with. So the setting up of categories and the setting up of policy permissions happens in the admin panel. The creation of policies themselves happen here in the front end, but we're going to come back to do that in a moment. So now we've got a bit of an idea about how Policy Manager looks for our front end users. Let's go and have a look at the admin panel and configuring. So we're going to go into Applications and into Admin, and we're going to go into Policy Manager. There it is. Okay. So within Policy Admin, what you'll see, like most of our admin panels, is an overview of all of the policies that are on the system. Now, as with most admin panels, you just kind of have an overview and can see everything. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are a part of the target distribution for that policy, or even that you can access the content of that policy. It just means you kind of have a map of all of those policies that have been created. And just like publish admin and documents admin. From here, somebody who has access to policy admin can come in, change permissions, etc., but can't adjust the kind of overall properties of the permission, so its content. So lots of similarities there between publish and documents admin. So really, if you want to change permissions, you can do it in the admin panel, but you can also do it from the front end, etc., etc. And again, this separation, which we all kind of get used to over time, is also very, very useful in that people can have the ability to create policies and effectively manage their own policies without having administrative access to the policy admin panel itself. So likewise, again, there are content separation for those permissions. It's kind of helping us get other people involved in managing policies. All right, so let's start talking about the configuration. So all of the main configuration area of Policy Manager Admin is at the bottom in these tabs. So it's a slightly different tab system to the one that we're used to looking at. Usually we have sort of some configuration over here on the right hand side and then tabs at the top. But what we're going to get at the top of this page is actually a list of all of the policies, and then our configuration area is at the bottom there. So let's start talking about categories. So one of the things about Policy Manager that is very, very strong is its levels of permissions. And permissions begin with categorization. So there's a couple of other applications where categories are simply organizational tools like idea spaces. And then there are other ones where categories actually allow us to restrict the content that goes into that particular category. So Policy Manager is one of them. Knowledge base is another example of that. So when we go to add category, it's going to ask us to set permissions on that category. And that's something we really have to bear in mind when we start working with Policy Manager in the front end. So we're going to come over here to the right hand side and add a new category. And we're going to talk about the options we have here. Okay, so I've already got a lot of example categories, which I never do myself any favours, do I? Let's come up with an example category for today. So you can see we've got really typical ones: grievance, health and safety, new starter, people, all of that kind of stuff. Let's talk. We've got profit share and finance, but let's talk accounting today because it feels like one of those days. Oops. So we're going to create a category for accounting. Then underneath that, we can apply or set up an icon for that particular category. And you can see there it gives you a recommended image size for that icon. So that's 198 by 100 pixels. And then below that, we can choose to add this accounting category to a subcategory that we might have. So down here, you can see we can select something like profit share and finance. And then once we submit, it will then become a subcategory of profit share and finance. If we choose to add to root level, it will appear on the first page of Policy Manager and will be its own category. So we're going to start with one of those. Now just below that, we have our trustee permission box. And in here, you can see we've already got all registered and they have the ability to view policies that are in the accounting category. And then we've got add policies. So they're very, very simple permissions when it comes to the categories. So let's put our trustee internet administrators in there and give them the right to add a policy. Okay. So in that one goes there. Now, if we want to add a subcategory, so if we go back and we add a subcategory underneath that, you will have seen that when I added one, it didn't actually change the permission box. So you can have different permissions on subcategories as well as parent categories. So that's one to think about. If you have a subcategory, you change those permissions, you need to make sure that it makes sense and that people who are kind of above you and only can see accounting can get to that subcategory as well. Now, once you set up these categories and the permissions, you can always go back into them and you can adjust them as you would suspect. So you can go back in, you can choose any of these and move them around as and when you want. So that's the first step. And categories on their own, like much back-end configuration, don't really do much until we start injecting some content into them. So we're going to travel on through our tabs at the top. So next up, we have status details. Now, when you first get Policy Manager, if you've never used it on your system and you go and have a look at it today, you will see this kind of setup. So at the top there, we have draft. In the kind of middle, we have distribution. And then at the end there, we have close. Now, I've written close in there, so it'll probably look like this. So draft is pretty self-explanatory. We're still working on the policy. It's not been distributed to the distribution group, and it's kind of sitting around waiting to be pushed to live, which is distribution. Now, sometimes that will be enough. The ability to save a policy as draft and then just push it to loads of users will be absolutely fine for some policies. But what you could do with status details is you'll notice that each of these boxes, and I kind of gave the game away a little bit when I deleted close down there, but with each of these boxes comes the opportunity for you to add an additional status to policies. So if you've got a ratification stage, a consultation stage, or you even want a status that is closed or archived, you can add them in there. Now, let's do some of that and see how they affect the policy category or the policies themselves. So you'll notice we'll have the name of the status there, and then we have the duration of days that status is ideally active for. Now, one of the things to mention about all of the setup that we're doing in here in status details is that when we get to the front end and add a policy, we can actually change the date at which that status expires. So these are kind of like default values for the statuses if we want to put them in. So we could say that the status draft is only kind of eligible for 30 days, and then after that it won't be active anymore. And then the other thing you have right at the end here is a rights label column. Now, because you have the ability to add statuses, what you also need is the ability to think about, well, who can see a particular policy when it's at that status? So there's no good us having a consultation status that everybody can see, because that's not going to make sense. And also the people we might want to consult on a particular policy might only be a few of many, many people we have on the system. So the rights label allows you to pull through to policy permissions an option to give people the ability to view that policy when it's on a particular status. So with that in mind, let's set one up. So I'm going to check enabled, and I'm going to put in a consultation stage. If I can spell it, consultation. There we go. So now we're going to leave the durations blank, but we could put 30 days if we wanted in there. And then we're going to add a rights label. So I'm going to say again, consultation. Now you'll notice that the one right at the bottom does not have a duration and does not have a rights label. And this is because this custom status is sort of saved for the end result of the policy. So actually when it goes to something like closed, the likelihood is that we don't want people to see it anyway. So we could check that box and we could call it something like archived. But you can have ones in the middle if you want, and lots of people do have different stages. You might even have kind of like a feedback stage or all of that kind of thing. Okay, so again, we're going to set those up and hit submit. There they all are, all saved and lovely. And then we're going to go to our next tab. So we're going to have a look at policy permissions. Now, in here are the default policy permissions. And I always kind of, when we have an admin panel that gives you the ability to add default permissions, I always like people to on the side, that one, on the side of caution. Because one of the things that default permissions are obviously great for is that when we go and create our policy, this is the setup it will always have. Now, I'm all for making life easier, always, but sometimes with particular types of content, like policies, for example, you maybe want to prompt people to actually set up permissions, because with default policy permissions set up, I can click submit or create a policy without having to think about who should actually see it. Now, obviously, this completely depends on the way you guys work or how your organization does stuff. If all policies, every single person on the system is a part of that target distribution, which must click a box and say, hey, yes, I've read this policy, then absolutely fine. Away we go in here. But if you do have a situation where you want to prompt people to think about who can see this policy, then maybe think about reducing the amount of permissions that you have in here. Now, this is also a heads up for what happens a little bit later on down the line, which is when we actually get to create a policy. Even though we have permission set up on our category, we still have to set up individual policy permissions for each object or asset of policy that we create. So default permissions are just kind of like a good start. And I guess it's a little bit like the inheritance of permissions when we're working with documents or publish. It's kind of designed to make things easier, which it does sometimes, but it's also something to be mindful of as we go through. So let's remove all registered, seeing as I'm going to practice what I preach. And in here, I'm going to choose my internet administrators. And then down here, I'm going to make sure that they have permissions to do all the kind of active bits and pieces that they can. Now down here, you'll notice we've got a target distribution, we've got consultation, and we've got feedback. So target distribution is there by default, and those are the people that have to comply to your policy. And this goes back to what I said at the very start of the session, which is that even though Policy Manager is very much about people complying with policies, it can also be a very useful read-only tool. So you can just give people the ability to view policies rather than having to actively partake in complying to them. Okay. All right. So we're going to take our internet admin out of target distribution and consultation and feedback. Incidentally, those two ones are pulling from obviously the statuses that I set up here. So if we change that rights lab, that will then figure through here. All right, so those permissions are fine. Pretty happy with that. And we'll just apply those just to double check, and then we'll move on to the very last tab. So it's a good tab, this one. We have the ability to apply a reference pattern to our policy. So every time we create one, it will say poll, or we could say ref, just to make, to show that. Then you've got policy items per page, and also the ability to display a link to the policy asset within the policy list. Now, what this means, and this is actually, it looks kind of very, what's the word? What am I looking for? Doesn't look like much of a big deal. That's not the word I was looking for, but that will do. This checkbox, it's in the last tab. It's kind of a bit, well, do you want to display a link? But actually what this means is if you do choose to display a link to the policy asset within the policy list, is that people can simply click on the document that you've attached or have related to a particular policy and just go and read it. If you don't have that checked, they have to physically go into the policy. They'll see a big green box which says something like awaiting your action. They'll also have the opportunity to download that asset there, but you're basically prompting them to go through that particular motion. Now, this checkbox does hark back to what we were just talking about in policy permissions, which is this kind of idea that as well as having a target distribution group for our policies that we send out, we can also use it as a reference point or a library of policies. And in that case, the likelihood is that you would want a link in the policy list that simply took people straight to whatever asset or object was attached to whatever policy. So again, this very much always depends on the way you want to tackle Policy Manager. Okay, so let's leave it unticked for now, and we're going to hit submit. All right. Okay, so we've set up our areas. So we've got all of our categories, our status details, permissions are set up, and remember that's default permissions. And we've also got our policy details in there as well. Now, from the admin panel, you will see that there is no plus icon anywhere. So it's not an illusion. You cannot add a policy from the admin panel. The only place you can do that is from the front end, and the only way that you can do that is if you have add policy rights to a category that has been set up in the admin panel. And I mean, what's good about this is that that's pretty consistent with a lot of other bits and pieces. Like you can't add a publish page from the admin panel, but you can add it if you have rights to add to a folder, all of that kind of stuff. And there's also a few other cool things in the admin panel. You can do things like check permission issues. So let's say you have a policy that you set up completely counteractive permissions on. Maybe the asset has different policies, maybe the category does. You can run a permissions check in here. And you can also export to CSV as usual. So you can kind of get a bit of a report from the admin panel as well. All right, so that's all the sciencey bit. Let's go and have a look at where the magic happens, which is in the front end of Policy Manager. Okay, so in here, there is our lovely accounting category. I didn't make it not look as exciting on purpose, but there it is. And if we click into that, we'll see we haven't really got anything there to start with. Now, most users who don't have add policy rights will just see these two buttons, but we have this little add policy button icon there. So we're going to click on that. And we're going to talk about all this stuff going on in here. So when we get to here, what we're doing is we are setting up our policy on the system. So we are creating an entry to Policy Manager, and then we are associating an asset with it. So that's the basic premise. And let's just talk a little bit about all of these other bits and pieces that we have in here. So we have to give our policy a reference, and you can see that word ref is pulling through from the admin panel that I set up. But you can also completely change that. So you can put your own reference numbers in there if you want to. You can abide by the admin setup, or you can just simply overwrite it. So let's put policy, and maybe we'll put 001. And let's give it a title. So we've got an accounting one. Let's call this something like payroll. Oops. Doing all the exciting stuff today, and let's give it a description. This is a policy about payroll. All right. Then we can choose what category to put it into. So let's pop it in there. And remember, as soon as we put it in a category, the permissions that are applied to that category are active. So only the people who will be able to view policies in accounting will be able to see it and will be able to therefore be a part of your distribution group. Then we can tag, so let's just choose these popular ones down here, and let's also add another tag for accounting. Then below that, you can separate the owner and the author of a policy as well. So if you are the person who is managing policies, uploading them, but you're not the one writing them, you can also make that known here. So let's put in another person in there. There we go. Now you can also select a survey from Claromentis surveys and polls to be a part of the policy itself. So if people have to complete a survey as a part of the policy, you can bring those in from Claromentis. All right. Okay, that's that side, and then let's have a look over here. So first things first, we have our statuses box, and there they all are. So there's draft, consultation, distribution, feedback, archived, etc., etc. So let's choose draft just for now, and then you can see we can set a status expiry date. So this overrides the one that we would have put in that admin panel, which is quite useful. So if we don't know about that expiry date, we can put one in here and everything will be well. And then you can also set a review date as well for that policy. Now the last one, probably the most important one of them all, is the asset type options. And these are going to be the files or the web links that you add that are associated to this policy. So our policy objects, effectively. Now, when you're working with Policy Manager, one of the things we always talk about in terms of best practices is the idea to kind of not be tempted by the first option unless you really, really need to. So we've got file upload and we've got document. File upload allows us to choose a file from our machine and upload it as you would expect. Oops, let's go for a document instead. Oh look, there's one I made earlier. So that allows us to upload this document from our local into Policy Manager. Now the catch with that is that then from this point onwards, the only way you can find that file is by going to this particular policy. So there's no other reference point for it on the system apart from in here. And now a lot of people do this, and that does work fine, but over time it can be a bit tricky. Let's say, for example, that you have a policy that is usually quite updated and you want to recall and send out again, etc., etc. Now, if you use file upload, obviously you're just talking about that particular policy at that particular point that you've uploaded. But if you use document and bring in a document that you have uploaded to the document management system, it means that there is always a reference point on the system for that. And even though the other side to it as well is actually that if you upload your policies to Document Manager or the DMS, you only have to do it once, and then you can just simply link to here from there. But I think it's very, very important because there's no, I guess one of the things we're always trying to do as, the brilliant internet admin we are, is streamline the process for our front end users. And sometimes people will just want to read a policy or just reference check it or do something that doesn't involve them going into Policy Manager doing this. And it is good to have references to documents because, they're, kind of more valid. And also you can use version control to keep that document updated. Whereas if you upload one from your local machine, you're just on that particular one that you uploaded. Yeah, sure, you can go back and re-upload it, but if you're managing documents anyway, you might as well do it like that. So that's one option, to upload from your local, or you can choose document and you get the good old select document option. Sometimes this will pop up in a new window, sometimes it will pop up in a new tab. It's all about browser settings. And let's see if I have a document around. I don't. Okay, let's go back and let's actually upload a little document for us to use. Alright, so let's go into here, and useful forms, and upload a document. There you go. Too quick. Brilliant. Okay, so jumping back to here, and obviously the other side of selecting documents is that you have to make sure that the people who are a part of your target distribution also have access to that document, or else they're not going to see it. So there we go, useful forms, policies, select that, and then we're good to go for that. The last one we also have is a web link as well. So as a part of any policy compliance, if people need to look at an internet page or a certain act or whatever that's linked somewhere else, you can also just select web link as well. So it's up to you how you work with those asset types. All right, then there's a few bits and pieces that we can look at before we leave. And as always, we've got our tab system at the top. So you've got related items. So let's just put this in as a example here. So let's say related link, and in here, let's put this. All right, and you can add another one and another one if you want. So if you have stuff that is related to this policy, it could be external, it could be internal, you can add it there. And then the last thing we have is permissions. And this is for the individual policy. And you can see, as soon as we get to here, we have our intranet administrators in this box. Because in the admin panel, we set up our default permissions. So intranet admin popped into there. And now we need to think about who else is a part of this particular process. So now we're here, let's actually talk a little bit about what all of this means. So a view policy is simply the ability to find it in Policy Manager and have a look at it. Target distribution means that you are accounted for, and if you check a box and you will see a box to say I have read this policy, then you become part of the target distribution. Consultation will mean that you can only see the policy at that particular status, and you can leave comments if you want to as well. Edit properties and delete properties are pretty self-explanatory, or sorry, edit properties and delete policy, pretty self-explanatory. And then again, we've got feedback as well. So that's who can see it on that very last status. Now, once we've done those, and remember that these permissions are simply on this policy. So we've got another layer of permissions protection, which could be category and subcategory. But again, in here, we have policies have their own permissions. Okay. So once we get here, the policy has been created. You can see there's the reference, title, the document object, creator, status, and any status expiry dates that we have on it. We don't, so that's fine. Now, at this point, obviously nobody can see it because it's still in draft. So if I click on the edit link, it will take me straight back to here. I'm now going to move that to consultation. And you can see it pulls in that automatic expiry date, which we put in the admin panel. And we're going to submit that. Okay, so now we have not only an area for policies down here, which are the ones I've created, but also at the top, when there is a policy that needs something from me, it will appear in this box up there. Now that doesn't just include those at consultation phase or one of our custom phase statuses, it will also show it if you're in a target distribution and you need to do something about a policy. So, okay, this is awaiting my action. Let's click into that. Now you'll see here in this consultation stage, I can accept or reject the policy, but I can also provide some feedback. So here we're going to put in our optional, oops, I can't spell optional feedback. There we go. And I'm also going to accept it at consultation stage. So in the comments area, you can see we can have a little discussion about the policy when it's in consultation. We have a version history if we have any versions associated to it. And then at the end here, we get a tab that relates to the status that the policy is on. So up here, you'll see the target distribution for the consultation phase was 5. Actually, let's refresh again, see if it pulls it through. There we go. So you'll see that the consultation stage, the target distribution for that point or that particular stage was 5, and 1 person has accepted it, and you can also find out when they did as well. Also, incidentally, you'll see at the top here we've got a little icon which allows us to have a look or download the policy. So if we click that, it will download it for us. We also have over here edit properties and those related items that we looked at as well. Now let's pretend in an ideal world that everybody has come in and said, yep, this policy is great, I'm happy with it, consultation stage is over. I can then go back into the policy and I can move it to distribution, which makes it live and sends out notification to all those people who are involved in the distribution. Okay, so now it's green. So we've gone from red to blue to green. And then if we go back into that, or if we click on it, you'll now see that this says something slightly different. So here, we're now in distribution stage. Now we get this big green massive box, which is prompting people to say, yep, I have read and understood that particular policy. The comments then lock down when they're in distribution. Version history, we don't have anything yet, so there's nothing in there. And then in distribution, again, you can see the tab up here has changed, but we get the same sort of feeling. So the target distribution for our distribution is 5. And if we accept it, so let's submit and give it a little bit of a refresh, you'll see there we have our target distribution is 5 and how many people have accepted it. Now, there's some cool things about Policy Manager. One is the ability to then export all of those people to a CSV file, so you can pull down distribution lists. You can search those users who have and haven't accepted. And then the big one, which is to send a reminder out about this policy. And what this does is it sends email reminders out to users. So from here, you can send an email reminder out if they haven't agreed to a particular policy or not. And then once all that's done, you can then follow on through the status progress. So if we go to manage policies, which will appear once you have some policies on the system, we can then lock that down and move that on, feedback or archive it. And you'll also note there that we've got the ability to recall this policy as well if we want to. Now let's just have a quick look in the admin panel just to see what's happening in there. Okay, I've just seen a question coming from Lois, so we're going to have a look at that in a sec. So back into Policy Manager. So now in here you can see that we have this particular policy, and from this point I can click on the permissions key and change that. And you can see in there that it says the following users don't have permissions to view the actual file referencing this policy. To change this link, follow this. So hopefully, Lois, this will give you an idea about that. So basically, if people do not have access to that document, it will work out that there is a conflict, and it will do everything it can to kind of show you that. And it's always good to check that. So if you go back into the admin panel or check permissions, it will then give you a little conflict symbol and tell you where the issue actually is. So basically, the permission setup on the documents is completely separate to those of the permissions itself. So Lois's question was that if a user has edit rights in the document management system, and that is also associated with Policy Manager, can this be prevented? or does it not give them permissions to any doc in Policy Manager? So they're completely separate is the answer to that question. So just because somebody is a part of the target distribution for a policy does not mean that they will automatically be able to go and do stuff for that document. In fact, it even means that they might not even be able to see that document if they're not correct. So hopefully that answers your question. Let me know if you have another one. Okay, so that's Policy Manager really. So it's quite a full introduction there. But if you haven't used it and you do have any policies that you want to bring in, or that is an important part of your system, it can be super useful. Also, I think that one of the things that comes up quite a lot is that, and I mean, you all know this, but documents can sometimes play such a absolutely massive part of the way we set up our intranets. And one of the things I think is always one of the battles is getting people to the right places. And if you have a particularly heavy going, very complex document management system, which I'm sure is beautiful, but is a bit weighty to get through, okay, people can search it. They can use, in documents, they've got a dedicated search area. They can look for stuff up here. But if, a part of your document management system is really a lot of policies, then actually having a bit of a layout like this might help. And again, might be a bit more outlay and work over time, but for our users, it's quite nice that if they're looking for a policy, they can just go to Policy Manager and kind of work it out from here. So not only is it good for compliance, which is cool, but it's also very good for just general storing of lovely looking policies, really. Okay, all right. So I think that'll do. Lois, hopefully that answers your question. Please let me know if you do have any more. And the next thing we're going to have a look at is, drumroll, smart objects in Publish. And this question is kind of related to one of the smart objects in particular, which is the forum smart object. But also it's a good excuse for me to kind of show you a little bit of Discover and our support site and how that can kind of really help you when it comes to Publish. And I know that one of the things that is, you work with on the intranet in your own way and other bits and pieces, but Discover is an excellent reference point, especially for published stuff. In fact, it's so excellent that I often still myself go there to have a look and to find out exciting things. So right, so we're going to talk a little bit about smart objects today, and what they are and how they work. So if you're familiar with Publish, Publish is our content management system where you manage pages, and there's kind of two levels to editing Publish or playing around with Publish pages. The first one, and I always say the same thing about Publish, is that it has the ability to be as simple or as complex as your needs require. And also it has the ability to be responsive to lots of different types of content. And it really, really helps if you have lovely looking, very content rich pages on the internet, because we're all about making this an essential resource for everybody. So the nicer we can make them, the better. Now, there are two levels, like I said, to playing around with Publish. The first one is the page level editing, which is where you go into your page. At the bottom of the page, you have edit. And then from here, you can click on any of these content areas and make some changes. Also, you might go to Publish and you might check out the page from there as well using this little icon, etc., etc. Now, we call this editing at page level, but there is also the ability to edit a published page at template level, and that is covered. If you are ever interested and you haven't really spent much time at Published Templates, we do a training session on that called Advanced Published Training. But don't let the word advanced put you off. It's just a lot of copy and pasting in the right places. But what that does is it talks about the actual HTML containers and code that shape the way published pages look. So there's our page level and then there's template level. And template level is where you can actually put things like components and bits and pieces into the actual page and no one can really change them from the front end. So that's a bit of context. So when you're working with Publish, you have editing at page level, which is this kind of thing. And then when you're working with templates, you can also edit pages, so HTML content. And I always think that Publish templates are, once you get into them, they're really something you stick with and you can take quite far. And they seem a bit not daunting at first, but there's a lot to them. So it's always good to have a little bit of a feel of them. And I also am of the belief that if you do play around with templates, you tend to over time get slightly more out of publish than you would if you don't. But like I said, it's completely subjective, really, isn't it? It's how much time you've got, all that kind of stuff, and what you need. So, smart objects then. So these things are kind of like little widgets that go into published pages at page level. So today we're not going to faff about with any HTML or any templates. We're just going to talk about our smart objects. Now, the reason why smart objects are, I was going to say smart then, but that, the reason why smart objects are slightly different to components is, first of all, their intended use, which is to go straight into the page. And second of all is the amount of things that you can change in a smart object. Whereas components are kind of geared to just go into HTML and find their kind of setup and styling from somewhere else, smart objects were more geared towards content creators and maybe even front-end users who deal with content, adding bits and pieces and widgets to their pages. Now, one of the other things I think is very, very good about smart objects and actually components is that they allow you to pull in information from other Claromentis applications. Your homepage will be full of components. There might even be a few smart objects thrown in there as well, just for good measure. But again, they do all lead back to that one road, which is getting people involved in the system and not really knowing that they're kind of, using lots and lots of different applications. And I think one of the beautiful things about the system is that you do have so many applications that do so many wonderful things. And one of the big kind of questions that always comes up is, well, how can we bring them all together? How can we make a one-stop page for our department teams to come in and go, oh, okay, there's my documents, there's a forum, there's a news article, bam, all at once. And smart objects and components in published pages are the number one way to do that. And obviously the proof is kind of in the home page as well, because we use both components and smart objects to, create your home page. So anyway, so this is Discover. If you haven't signed into it before, you should, because it's brilliant. And also the plan is in a few weeks' time actually to make Discover public. So actually those users who don't have an admin account to sign in and ask questions will be able to access Disco as well. So in the knowledge base on Discover, which is under the self-help heading, you will find an article called Smart Objects and Components. And this is one of my favourite articles because it's a beautiful overview of all of the ones that we kind of have. Actually, not all of them, but most of them. And it's actually all of the smart objects, but not all of the components. So you get the popular components and the smart objects. Now, the reason why this article is particularly good is not only because it says everything I've just said in a shorter way, but also because each of these links comes with a lovely little article that will allow you to download the piece of code or the little widget code to embed in a published page, and also talks about every single parameter that you can change within a smart object. So you can see here, I'm going to have to scroll as well, that there are a lot of them. So instead of giving people kind of the daunting task of saying, hey, go and put this component in this template and good luck, actually what you can do is you can give them a smart object and they can start changing quite substantial things very, very quickly. So we're just going to run through the process of changing a few parameters and embedding a forum smart object into a page. Now, each of these articles has at the bottom here a click to download the source code link. It's cool. It's quite, you can see it now. It used to be the same color as the text, but we've got it. So let's click that, and it will download a little file like this. So it's called forumsmartobject.js. Now, if you have a machine that does not have the ability to, or you don't have anything on it that kind of edits code on it, like a text editor, Notepad++, Notepad, Sublime, Text Wrangler, all of those things. Also, if you're on a Windows machine, maybe, and sometimes on a Mac, if you double click that straight away, or when you click on it and open it, it will try and run it as a program. You don't want it to do that. You want it to download, and then you want to choose what it opens in. Now, on a Mac, obviously we've got open with. On a Windows, I think it's open with as well, isn't it? So you want to choose to either open it in something really simple like Notepad, or if you do have a text editor, you can do that as well. So I'm going to ignore the default and actually go for text editor, and it will open it up. Obviously on my other screen, which is handy. Let's bring that back in. And it'll open it up here. So this is how this little script looks. And in here are all of those parameter lists that are on that Discover article. So we can see we've got the forum ID, we've got the code name of the forum, the height, the width, all of that kind of stuff. So we're going to copy that, and we're going to go back to our intranet. And you can see there are all the parameters, so that all works fine. And then we're going to go all the way back to our page. Now, in here, one of the things with smart objects is they are very, very much trial and error. So you maybe will put one in and it won't automatically look exactly how you plan it to look. So you're going to have to tweak parameters. You're going to have to play around with them, not only to make it look how you want, but also to make it look good. So we need to put that code into a content area. So we're going to edit a content area on the page. And if we want to add a smart object, we need to switch to source mode, which is at the top here. And we need to paste it in here. Because source mode is the raw HTML code of the page, which allows us to embed things into it. Incidentally, if you use any websites, have any websites that you know of that have embed codes or widgets, you can also bring these in like this as well. And a few weeks ago, I was working with a client who had a few bits and pieces on TripAdvisor, loads of other websites, Vimeo, YouTube, even Google Maps has embed codes. So if you do want to bring, content in from other applications and other web services, you can do it in this very similar format. So switch to source mode and then make your parameter changes. So each of those smart objects will have an identifier for ID. And object ID is what functions and what basically pushes content into a smart object. So where possible, in fact, actually not where possible, always, you need to make sure that you have the ID for whatever content you're trying to bring into this smart object. Now, the ways to find these are different depending on the application. Usually you will find them by going to the relevant content and having a look in the URL, and there will be a number up there. But there is also an article on Discover, which is finding object IDs, I think. There we go. There's a lovely article here which walks through how to find the IDs for all of these things. So basically all of the things that are smart objects or components for. I'm not sure why those images are broken, but they shouldn't be. So I'm going to check that out as well. So in here, what you will notice is if you look through this particular article, is that there's no consistent way to find them. I usually always rely on the fact that they're in the URL. But for example, if you go to something like Innovate, so let's go to Innovate Admin, you'll find that the ID for Innovate channels is in a nice little list here. But if you want to look for a news channel, for example, you will need to kind of go into news, and you can even search a channel, and then up in the top it will say ID equals 1. But they vary from application to application. So sometimes they're object ID, sometimes it's forum ID, sometimes it says key. There's loads and loads of different ones depending on what you're working with. Then we have other bits and pieces that will relate to the actual application itself. So when you're setting up forums, you can have code names as well. Then we've got width and height, which is in all of them, which is our kind of ability to change how that particular smart object works. We're going to leave that as that for now, just because I want it to look terrible so we can come back and do that. And then we've got loads of other bits and pieces like does it scroll? Do we want to show owner, date, created, topic, name, body text, character counts? This template just refers to the styling. So if you do want that changed, we can do that. And then you've got loads of other bits and pieces over here, like how big are the page sizes? Do we show paging? And all of these, if we go back to that article, will be fully explained in the relative article for that smart object. So if we pop into there, we can find out at the bottom here what scrolling actually means and the possible values. So all of those are fully documented as well, which is quite useful. So right, let's say we've made our changes. If we switch back to source mode, you will not see the smart object in there. The only time you will see the smart object is when you come down here and hit save, and then it will display in this particular area here. So there's forum 1, and you can see there's the 2 topics that have been posted in there. And the process is pretty much similar with all of the other smart objects. So if we have a quick look at, let's go for new smart object. When you get to the article, you can see we've got the download code, which is in there. And then we have all of these parameters down here as well. And if we open that up, and I would recommend that one of the kind of best things about smart objects is to get one that you really like, get everything exactly as you want it. So get all the parameters correct, make it look really nice, be really happy with it, and then distribute that to other people as your kind of standard smart object. Because if you kind of leave it as this, it doesn't always work so well. So we're going to copy that, jump back to our publish page, and we're going to tempt fate, and we're going to put it in here. So we're going to edit that content area, switch to source mode, pop that in there. Oops. There we go. And we can change little parameters in there if we want. You can see that's called channels. So that's the list channel that we want to bring in. And you can also sometimes bring in multiple streams of content as well. So you could have a new smart object that had like 15 news channels being pumped into it. And there you can see is the smart object. Now, also down here, we've got like these few little bits and pieces down here, so we probably wouldn't want that. So we can go back in there, switch to source mode, and change parameters a little bit here. So we might have, let's just remove everything apart from title and image and see how that reflects. You can also have multiple smart objects on a page as well. That's another thing to flag. Not very interesting, but you get the idea. So all of a sudden that's changed. And also the last thing to say as well is that you can have multiple smart objects on one page. You just need to make sure that they have individual names as you go down. So if this was the first news, we might have my news 1, another one my news 2, etc, etc. It just stops them clashing and allows you to have multiple smart objects on one page. And if you give it time and have the kind of time to play around with them, you can actually do quite nice things with them. So document smart object, for example, is a really nice way to bring in a folder from the document management system. But a lot of people see it, and I think it has like blue folders and stuff like that. But a lot of people see it and kind of like, oh, it doesn't look exactly how we want it to. But using all of these parameters here, you can really basically start to slimline the smart objects and make them look how you want to. So don't feel like just because the way it arrives is the way it arrives is the way it's always got to be. It doesn't at all. Also, incidentally, if you do try to use smart objects or components and they don't look quite right and there's nothing you can do to help that, let us know and our design team can have a look at the styling for you and do a few bits of magic to make those work. And that's smart objects really. So like I said, one of the things to do is to jump on Discover and have a look at this article. So it's smart objects and components overview, and it just gives you a really nice introduction to all of the smart objects that we have. Incidentally, if you do get into using components as well, don't forget that we also have a Claromentis GitHub account, which is a repository where all of our components are, and these range from everything to traffic components to weather components to document components and stuff like that. So Discover's first port of call, but then if you want a little bit more, you can head over to our GitHub repository. All right, okay, so we are now coming up to the end of the session. I think everyone's all right. No questions have come in, which is always, well, kind of sad, but that's all right. And what we'll do, as always, after the call today, if you do think of any questions afterwards, feel free to drop me an email and I'll do my best to get back to you. And also, as always, at the end of tomorrow, this video will be up on YouTube. So if you want to rewatch it again, or actually if you want to rewatch any of the drop-in sessions that we've had, they are all on our YouTube channel, which is Claromentis UK. You can subscribe and do all of that kind of exciting stuff. And they're also just really good reference points, even if I do say so myself. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for coming along to the session today. Always so appreciate you attending, all of the questions, etc., etc. And likewise, any problems, let us know. And yeah, we will speak to you soon. Thank you so much for your time and have an absolutely lovely rest of your week. Thank you very much. Bye.